panel discussion, and it's going to be wrangled for us this morning by somebody who's certainly no stranger to the University of Queensland. Dr. Brian Keating did his PhD here at UQ. He's currently the adjunct professor at the university in association with QRM. It's an honorary appointment that really follows on from a 40-year association in agricultural research Australia and abroad, in Australia and abroad. Brian's career has focused on productivity and sustainability of agricultural systems, both here and in sub-Saharan Africa. And with the possible exception of Robert Henry, there are few people that spend as much time thinking about building better food and farming systems than Brian Keating. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Can I join other speakers up front in acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands from which we virtually gather? I'm joining you from the lands of the Bundjalung people in northern New South Wales. We're now also part of the famous border bubble, but it's great to be here. And as Peter mentioned, I'm a member of the Coffee Advisory Board, and can I, apart from acknowledging the very senior leaders from the university and the Department of Ag and Fisheries, can I acknowledge my co-board members who are online today. Look, we're really fortunate to be joined by a panel of leaders from the rural R&D system. And I'll just check they're all online. I can see, yes, I think they're all online. They'll turn their videos and audio on when they're ready. But anytime now, I think you're welcome to join us. There's Jason there. Thank you. I can see you all now. I'll introduce you. We've got Jason Strong from Meat and Livestock Australia, Tony Williams from Grains R&D Corporation, Alison Anderson from Horticulture Innovation Australia, and John Harvey from AgriFutures. Great to have you here. And they'll each have some introductory comments in a few minutes. Let me just set the scene here, if I can. Australia's R&D system has many strengths and some unique features. Most notably, the federal legislative framework that enables contributions towards R&D from many small industry participants to be pulled together and invested towards priority industry needs and opportunities is a foundation strength, I think. Many would see that as a classic textbook case of how to go about addressing market failure for lots of small participants. And of course, matching that industry investment with public funds from government further strengthens the system and enables the overall R&D system to deliver public goods in economic, environmental and social terms. This system's been in place for, I think, over 30 years now, and it's become more significant than ever as a major source of funding and direction to our rural innovation system. In 2019-20, 461 million of industry levies were gathered and co-invested with 351 million of government funds. So over 800 million of investment there. And then R&D partners across the broad spectrum co-invest with that, groups like QRM. So something like 1.2 to 1.4 billion per annum has been invested in this system in the last year or two. Now, in a pre-pandemic 2019, we would have all been sitting in the Brisbane Convention Centre, and we'd certainly be discussing some of the pressures on the R&D system. Pressures and opportunities, I think I should add. The continued availability of that public investment and availability of co-investments from research participants is an ongoing issue. Like many fields of public endeavour, there's a relentless drive to drive efficiency across the system, reduce complexity and overlaps. As there should be, pressures on the improvement in the translation of research into industry impact and innovation, delivering demonstrable value to industry investors and to the government investors. Pressures and opportunities to address cross-sectoral issues and value chain issues. And I note the announcement this week of the Agricultural Innovation Australia initiative, and what a great thing that is to see that starting to happen. Better linkages to the wider global agri-tech developments. Australia only does a few % of the world's R&D, and so there's lots of opportunities to better connect globally. And of course, for groups like Coffee, and for many of the people online today, many of the participants, the continued development of relevant research and development capabilities, the career possibilities of many of the students and early career, mid-career scientists who are online today. But it's not October 2019, it's 2020, and we find ourselves in a pandemic world. And looking down the tunnel, I think, hopefully, to what will become a post-pandemic world of 2021-22. So what does this mean for our R&D system? What's different and what's the same? Are the challenges I've raised earlier still relevant, more relevant than ever, or perhaps they've been overtaken by new pandemic-specific challenges? So each of the panel is going to make some comments around these issues, about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to have a panel discussion around some topics that I'll try and facilitate. I've asked the panel to not just talk about research funding, or not just talk about the what of research funding, but also of the how. How's the R&D system operating, and where are there opportunities to address pandemic challenges and to address some of the broader opportunities for improvement that I've been talking about. Now, I'll just follow the order of my notes, if panelists are okay with that. We're going to start with Tony Williams from GRDC, then go to MLA, Horde Australia, and finish, John, with you on Agri-Futures, if that's okay. So let me pass over to Tony Williams, the new CEO of new Managing Director of GRDC. I think he told me he's been in the job about 2 months now. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks, Brian. And look, appreciate the opportunity to address the distinguished guests and attendees. Given time is short, I wanted to probably just jump into your two challenges, what and how. From a research funding point of view through the GRDC eyes, I've got a really positive outlook, I suppose, on grains, Australian grains, and the role they play in the global market. I think it's critical to take a global perspective relative to things like market penetration and product mix, as there's a big, hairy, audacious goal out there from the National Farmers Federation of $100 billion by 2030 for ag output. And I think grains is going to play a particularly key role in that. So, I think those two elements of market penetration and product mix are critical. I appreciate that Beth made a very valid point around food service in the domestic market earlier, that COVID's had a great impact, massive impact globally with respect to how businesses operate. Regardless of that, I'm still pretty bullish in the post-pandemic world because I think the role that food, feed and fuel will play, and obviously grain has a particular contribution to those, will still be critical. And I think global demand will continue. Once again, as one of the other speakers said, I think we're on our path to 10 billion global population by 2050. That's going to require people to be fed, animals to be fed, and fuel, non-fossil fuel, shall we say, alternative fuel. In terms of, I suppose, GRDC investment priorities, it really is going to be around competitiveness and differentiation. I think they're going to be the key drivers. When I talk about competitiveness, it's really, if I use my sort of private sector experience, I talk about stay in business investments and productivity improvements. So things like yield improvements, input cost reductions, improved farming systems, etc., are all really about those keeping us competitive from a global marketplace perspective. I think differentiation is the other key driver, and where we look at sort of growth and value creation. When I talk about that, and we've seen the other presenters talk about the downstream shifts in consumer patterns, things like the shift from or the addition, shall we say, of greater proportions of plant protein on top of the animal protein. I think there'll always be a market for both, but the affordability of plant protein in some of the more emerging markets like India and Africa, etc., may very well be on the path of emerging markets. So those sorts of opportunities. I think things like market quality, traceability, and then particularly optimum performance specs. When I have a look at my background in milling and oilseed processing, to be able to buy the right sorts of commodities that maximize the throughput of the processing plants is a value creation point as well. So I think they're the sorts of areas where, across the spectrum of our sort of 5 strategic pillars, grains GRDC should be focusing. You asked about the how, and I suppose once again, referring to my private sector background, the way I tend to look at how is, if I think of GRDC as the business development and innovation department of the grains business in Australia, then I think we sort of position ourselves as what are the things we should be working on that allow, for want of a better term, the operators to produce, and that's going to be the growers, and the salespeople to sell, and that's the sort of downstream marketers and processors, the food manufacturers. From that perspective, what are the skills we need within our business? If I look at a manufacturing facility from end to end, and I think about where the bottlenecks are, our approach to capacity and ability development is really going to be looking at those scientific and research sort of disciplines and approaches that we need to bring the ideas to life, and understanding where in the market are there bottlenecks for those that interrupt, I suppose, the optimum flow of initiatives and opportunities to come out for both growers and the general market, both domestically and internationally. So when I have a look at those sorts of an approach, it becomes obvious for me. And when we talk about, I suppose, shifts in maybe the historical focus of where GRDC has looked, not so much in terms of substitute, but shall we say complementary nature of investments like digital, ag tech, some of those, I suppose, product differentiations that I spoke about. There's going to be sort of new and different research skills required in the future. That really does make this an exciting place to be. I think the thing about research is that it's always challenging us to find out what we don't know and then use what we've just learned to adapt the way we do things. And I think the focus that GRDC will have relative to developing capabilities and capacities in the research space will be as forward-looking as it needs to be, relatively stable in our usual block and tackle sort of research type opportunities. So from that perspective, I think the how is going to be about looking along the different value chains, looking past the farm gate, well past the farm gate into destination markets, and making sure we understand how our investments in RD&E can support accessing those markets, providing the consumer benefits, making things logistically more efficient, and then obviously working through our research partners like Coffee to then deliver that in a very tangible, on the ground way.
Thank you, Tony. And strong messages there. Beyond the farm gate, global, a bullish view of the marketplace and the opportunities. So let's hear from Jason from MLA. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Brian, and a great kick-off from Tony. I just wanted to focus a little bit on the timing, and you made the comment about the levy system being in place for about 30 years, and that's been a lot of our focus in the last 12 months or so with a new strategic plan, our new 5-year strategic plan, but also the Red Meat 2030 10-year plan that the industry put in place last year. And if we think about the timing of those plans, but also the journey we've been on over the last 30 years for levy programs, or 21 years for MLA, now the red meat industry is fundamentally different It's fundamentally different to what it was when levies were put in place or when MLA was formed. And the best evidence we have of that is the commodity positioning or pricing during the two drought years of the 18-19 years, which are two of the worst years known to man from a climate point of view for agriculture. Yet we had all of our commodities at or above 5-year averages. And this really flies in the face of what we've seen historically as far as supply and demand pricing structures. And it's because our industry structure is fundamentally different. Our supply chains are more sophisticated, whether we realise it or not. We are strengthening our through supply chain commitment or connection to our consumers or our customers. And even though we're still very fragmented, we're seeing the benefit of this supply chain sophistication. And there's only a very small number of things which really drove that fundamental change in the industry. And it's things like traceability, better biosecurity, but also traceability and product identification, and being able to make origin claims about our product. Meat grading, so being able to produce a high quality product that we can commit to our consumers and know that we'll deliver on a more consistent basis, and market access. And the time that MLAs existed, the industry has gone from one trade agreement to about 14. So you can get up to 10 or 15 things on that list of what's been impactful, but really it's only a handful of things. But in that time, we've done 12,500 projects. So I think our challenge and the point we're at the moment is that we don't need more stuff. We don't need to know more things. We need to know more about a smaller number of things. We need to take a lot of the information that we already do know, that we have discovered, that we have developed, and put it to much better use. And it's our use, application, extension, whatever term or approach we want to use, that is going to be important for us going forward. So our 5-year plan has come off the back of the Red Meat 2030 plan. And the thing that's really clear about both of those things is they're incredibly focused. So very focused on a smaller number of things, on things that will be impactful and actually drive or support change in the industry. And this has a fundamental impact on how we then think about our broader approach and investment in research and development. So getting away from answering interesting questions, getting away from project-driven investment to things which are driven by insight. So we understand exactly why we're making investments. We have projects and programs of work which are under much greater scrutiny as far as their performance and execution is concerned, and a connection to a direct implementation or input into the market if we do actually solve the question we ask, or we actually develop the thing which was part of the initial premise. So this significant shift from individual and quite often isolated programs or projects, programs of work or projects, to more programs which are more strategic, they're more focused and very much driven by impact, but then also having this level of accountability across our organisation and the approach to our investment that makes sure that we're getting value for money on behalf of the industry for those investments, and that we're using our resources, both people and money, in the best possible way. And there's a few fundamental shifts in that. So it's moving away from working out what money have we got to spend, to what are the best projects that need to be funded. And when we find which are those best projects, then working out actually how we fund them and how we allocate red meat levies or co-funded levies or government co-funding or external commercial dollars. So there's certainly a shift in the way that we're approaching things, and an opportunity for us to invest in a more strategic and collaborative way on a smaller number of things which are going to be more impactful for the industry.
Thank you, Jason. So some important messages there for the researchers on the line. Much greater focus, 21 years, 12,500 projects. More number of things that really made a difference. And they're not all things at the upstream research end. Many of them are at the market delivery translation end. So we might pick up that in the discussion. Can we go to Alison Anderson? Alison's the General Manager for R&D with Horticulture Australia, and she joins us with her her close friends in the background. Welcome, Alison.
Thanks very much, Brian. And yeah, thanks, Jason and Tony, for really kicking off well. The messaging is going to be similar, I think, across all the RDCs. So for the researchers on the line that haven't, worked with Hort Innovation, we're the RDC for horticulture, obviously, and our primary function, as it is for all RDCs, is to create value for our growers and those across our supply chain. So when we're talking about creating value, we're talking about more than just improving productivity. I think that we've had a big focus on productivity improvements over the last 20 years, but now we're also moving more into that creating demand and ultimately increasing farm gate profitability and global competitiveness of Australian horticulture and agriculture. Tony mentioned our $100 billion goal for the value of agriculture in Australia. For horticulture, it currently sits at 13 billion, and we're looking at how we move that dial to about 20 million. So a really big challenge for RDCs and the broader industry. To set the scene, Hort Innovation, we currently manage 400 individual projects with a life of project value combined at about 413 million. So that includes the in-kind from delivery partners, and acknowledge that considerable in kind from delivery partners and bringing that also to the benefit of our industries. The projects are delivered over 150 unique delivery partners. So yeah, a really broad range of partners that are bringing value and their unique capabilities to our industries. For Hort Innovation, about $55 million last year was invested in our strategic R&D investment. I'll explain that a little bit more. And 54 million in our Hort Frontiers and non-levy investment, which includes 12 million in grant funding. So we'll hear a lot more about co-investment and how we invest in transformational research beyond what our industry levies do. Our investments are funded by grower levies and Australian government contributions, but also other contributions from our co-investment partners. And that's what underpins our Hort Frontiers strategic initiative. And I really think in the how of what we do, we'll be looking much more at that Hort Frontiers, how we bring in additional co-investment. Our industry levies aren't going to increase significantly. So how do we bring in that co-investment from investment in the longer term transformational research areas? At Hort Innovation, we invest in 37 industry levy funds and 7 Hort Frontiers funds. So those Hort Frontiers funds are really where we see the need for that transformational. At the moment, they are currently fruit fly, pollination, international markets, green cities, health, nutrition, food safety, advanced production systems, and of course, leadership. The leadership capability really underpins our ability to continue to invest in research, but also to build that capability within our industries to adopt the outputs of our research. As Jason and Tony have said, our investment decisions for the future, they'll be deliberate, they'll be considered, and they'll be evidence-based, with innovation sitting at the heart of what we do. But instead of just focusing on lots of projects, we'll be looking at what is evidence-based, where are the benefits likely to come from, and investing in those areas. At the moment, we've got our industry strategic investment plans across our 37 industries. They all come to an end this financial year. So I think the timing is probably ideal, that given the disruption of COVID-19 and the need to address emerging opportunities and risks, by doing the new investment plans, we'll be able to develop new strategies for now and beyond for the horticultural industries. What we're really looking at doing is having strategies across key outcome themes of data and insights, productivity gains, demand creation, extension and adoption. Jason mentioned it, but appropriate extension strategies and assumptions around adoption are going to be core to our investments. Without adoption, we can't realise the benefits of our R&D investments. So partnerships with research delivery partners must be focused on our research priorities, but each project must also know its impact pathway. It must know how it's going to be adopted, what linkages need to be made with other projects or industry communications and extension projects to really realise the benefits. So across the RDCs, there's going to be that increased focus on impact pathways so that the outcome each project is directly responsible for achieving is clear. Um, Moving into some of the areas of want, researching funding such as biosecurity, pollination, advanced production systems, and climate preparedness will continue to be a priority. These are core to the continuing prosperity of Australian agriculture. However, during COVID-19, there's other priority areas have emerged or become increasingly important, and especially given the impact on exports and labour. So some of the areas we've been investing in and we'll be looking to do more so in the future is around those data and insights, those macro indicators of consumer behaviour and attitudes, but also those specific to horticulture. We do have a cross-sectoral project that's managed by AgriFutures about understanding community trust issues and how do we use that community trust type information to support evolving R&D and marketing responses. We're looking to invest more in nutritional analysis and those claims to support demand creation. Labour is really important for horticulture sector. We have done a study on to better understand the impacts of COVID-19 on labour, and that report was released last week. The others mentioned, how do we create demand through alternative uses with horticultural products? If we've lost export markets in the short term, how do we move beyond the fresh product and value add our horticultural products? Emerging technology, especially in the areas of creating efficiencies in labour, but importantly for the RDCs, how do we support adoption of new technology that's not readily trialled on individual farms? And as I mentioned, trade, continuing to support export market development and trade, but also the ensuring product integrity. I think across the RDCs, it's also going to be really important for us to look for collaboration opportunities. We do have limited resources, so how do we look at the synergies for cross-sectoral investment and in horticulture, multi-industry investment efficiencies? So a really good example across the plant-based RDCs is the Plant Biosecurity Research Initiative that aims to increase collaboration and get those real efficiencies in our research. Some other key areas include technology, and AgriFutures is really leading that area through conferences like EvokeAg, and sustainability and climate science are other areas that there's cross-sectoral collaboration. So I'll leave it there, and thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Alison. Some consistent messages there. I'm picking up deliberate, considered, evidence-based, real strong focus on the impact pathway, interest in longer term transformational work as well, but also interest in finding ways of getting additional co-investors on board. Just a couple of things that really I took down from there. Thank you, Alison. John Harvey, deep experience in the commodities with grains, R&D, and now experience in the cross-cutting work and the emerging industries work of AgriFutures Australia. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Brian, and good to see you again, and great to see some familiar faces from QOFI. Can I just say up front, congratulations to QOFI. Can't believe it's 10 years, and it's been very exciting to watch the growth of QOFI over that 10 years. I also want to just congratulate the Queensland Government for actually hanging in there and continuing to invest in QOFI. I think it's shown their commitment to agriculture, so well done, and great outcome. Just a couple of things I wanted to say. First one is certainly COVID-19 has thrown up a few challenges for primary producers in Australia. One of the industries we look after is beekeepers. And if you're trying to move a hive of, a truckload of bees from Queensland down to the almonds in southern New South Wales, it can be pretty challenging getting them through some of the checkpoints. So it hasn't been all clean sailing. Certainly access to labour has been challenging. But it also has brought some good things. For the first thing is, first time in my life, seeing supermarket shelves without food and produce and meat on the shelves really reminded people in the city how important the value chains are and agriculture is and farmers are. And I was talking recently to Ian Halliday, who was the Managing Director of Dairy Australia, now is the Trade Commissioner in Dubai, and he was saying, if you think your guys in Australia were worried about food security, you should come over here where 95% of our food's imported, and they are seriously concerned, and COVID-19 has really given them a big wake-up call to having the right strategic relationships in place and access to food. So it has certainly raised the profile and the importance of agriculture, food production, fibre production, right across the whole world. And I think that increase in profile is something that we need to really capitalise on. The second really positive thing I think to come out of COVID-19 for Australia is, we've had 30 years or nearly 30 years of continuous growth. And I think over that 30 years, a little bit of complacency has possibly crept into our society and into our expectations of the future. And I think COVID has well and truly blown that up. And I think as we adjust, as the economy adjusts over the next few years, I think it will be pretty tough for lots of people in the community, including people in agriculture. And we will need to do things differently. And I think that sense of complacency is very much evaporated, which is a good thing. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about a couple of things that Bronwyn Harsh mentioned and also Beth Woods mentioned. When about 2 years ago, David Littleproud, when he was minister first time around, when he came back and he spoke to all the RDCs, the CEOs of the RDCs in Brisbane, and his comment was, rural innovation, agricultural innovation is critical to the future of Australian agriculture. But I can't give you any more money. You're not going to be getting any more money out of government. You guys have got to start looking at what's happening overseas and partnering more with the private sector. And that was his opening line. And that was on the back of having been, I think he went to Canada and I think he went to the Netherlands. And I'm not sure, but I think he might have gone to Israel as well. But his message very strongly to the CEOs back then in October 2018 was, you guys are going to need to partner more with the private sector. And I just wanted to run a couple of figures past you. And sorry, before I do, the other comment that Beth Woods made, she alluded to the fact there was all these new technologies, and a number of people have also mentioned, digital ag, sensors, Internet of Things, synthetic biology. I just wanted to comment that a lot of those technologies are quite different to what we've done in the past. I know, my time in GRDC, for example, we put a lot of effort into new varieties, into farming systems practices. They're all bred very specifically for the Australian environment. They're all the farming practices were very specific to our production systems here in Australia. Well, some of these new technologies are highly, highly scalable, and they're being developed and they're being delivered on a global platform, and that is very different. And it means that if we want to be a key player in some of these technologies, we have to be on the global stage. And we have to be on the global stage if we want to access private capital. So I was in San Francisco about 18 months ago, and one of the startups we bumped into there was a food company. They were doing a capital raise. They raised 300 million US in one capital raise. And I was sitting there thinking, that's probably equivalent to what the federal government puts into all the RDCs combined in one capital raise. Just if you look at the investment in agri-food tech over the last 5 or 6 years, globally, it's gone from $2.5 billion to $18.8 billion last financial year. It's a huge investment going into agri-food technology. In Australia, in 2017, there was $29 million worth of deal flow. In 2018, $49 million worth of deal flow. Last year, $90 million worth of deal flow into agri-food tech here in Australia. So rapidly growing, but a tiny component of what's happening in the rest of the world. So Minister Littleproud said a couple of times he'd love to see Australia as an agri-food innovation hub for the Southern Hemisphere or this part of the world. What's critical is we really need to be on that global stage, and it's got to be easy, I think, for those global players to be able to do business with us. And Alison alluded to Evoke Ag. That was our attempt to try and make it easier for people to come down to Australia and see the best of the best and see the good research that's going on in Australia and see commercial opportunities. And I guess we're growing that opportunity with GrowAg now, where we're putting into one platform all of the RDC projects across RDCs and also the commercial opportunity. So people looking to Australia and New Zealand can see what commercial opportunities are available here for them to potentially partner with or invest in. So my challenge to QOFI is, you've obviously done very, very well in terms of ARC, Queensland government funding, funding from RDCs, funding from Bill and Melinda Gates foundations and alike. I think there's an even bigger opportunity. Well, there's another opportunity there for you, which is playing on that global stage, accessing capital from the private sector, be it venture capital, angel investors, or family companies, or whatever. But there is an opportunity there, but it's a very different style of interaction, but potentially, I think, hugely important in terms of the new technologies and how they're likely to scale globally. So, Brian, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, John. Really, really great comments at this point in the process. Challenging people to take a global perspective, look beyond the traditional sources of funding, and once again realise that some of the big change is going to come from what's happening overseas, and so we either have to be part of it or it's going to we're going to miss out. Look, we've got about 15 minutes at max left. I wanted to get a bit of discussion going amongst the panel around some of the issues they've raised. I have a couple of questions here just to kick this off. We'll get back to that bigger picture that John left us with at the end, I think, but I'm going to start with some smaller picture issues. You know, noting that it's the big picture we have to get to, absolutely. But smaller picture, if you're in the university at the moment, you're feeling pretty battered and bruised with some of the funding situation. Look, I don't know the exact number, but there's something like maybe $5 billion going to disappear from the R&D system. Maybe more, maybe less. Others on the line will know better than I do. But some fraction of that is obviously in agriculture, agri-food, and it could, if it was 5%, it could be a few $100 million all of a sudden going to disappear from the investment portfolio of the RDCs. What's your view? Is it, you know, not an issue, someone else's problem, perhaps an opportunity for some of the change that you're talking about as well? What, any takers on a reflection on how the universities should be viewing their situation, or a fairly substantial funding shift? It's open to anyone. Who wants to jump in first? Jason, you're on mute. You go first.
I'm happy to jump in. It's a real concern, obviously, for the institutions, but it also is to the broader RDC community as well. But I think that the timing of it also is in line with the need for us to look for, you know, additional, not necessarily alternative sources of funding. Because if we talk about focusing on smaller, more impactful things and getting things completed and, you know, running them to ground and getting them implemented, we don't have enough money in the system anyway. You know, we've one of our flagship projects on the sustainability side around CN30, you know, trying to target towards carbon neutrality by 2030. We've got a runway to how we can get there, but we don't have enough money to fund those sorts of projects and programs. So while, yes, this is very challenging and it must be incredibly confronting in those environments, I think, you know, it also falls in line with our need to look at alternative sources of funding as well, or additional sources of funding. It's not about replacing other funding, it's about how do we actually find additional funding as well. So I think what it will also do is ensure that we actually have more strategic discussions sooner about what it is we're going to spend funding and resources on, and how we're going to allocate and account for those things in driving projects, rather than it being more of a transactional, you know, financial discussion.
Thank you, Jason. So I'm hearing confronting, but perhaps part of the necessary change that we're going through anyway, and harder discussions, more strategy, and more focus on what's absolutely critical than just hundreds of projects going on all the time. Yep. That's what I'm hearing from Jason. Any other panel members want to add to that, or endorse it, or have a different perspective? John.
Just a comment on that, and both Jason, Tony, and Alison mentioned, you know, John, are you still with us?
Let me, we'll wait for John to return. He's jumped up for something. Tony, you go next.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And look, just building on what Jason said, and I concur with the other speakers. I think the shape of what we feel we really want to invest in is going to morph over the coming years. I totally agree with Jason's focus, and I think Alison mentioned it as well, on execution and adoption. We know so much of what we know can create so much benefit. So I would tend to call that Horizon 1. And if I think about, this in a 3 horizons, that standard sort of McKinsey way of looking at things, what I want to look at in Horizon 1 is going to require one type of research and, I suppose, execution partner skill set. When we think about the Horizon 3 stuff, which, once again, totally aligned with Jason's commentary about fewer, bigger, transformational stuff. I think from that perspective, once again, that's going to create new and interesting, different research opportunities that'll take us down some of those, pathways that some of the other speakers spoke about. Not just obviously Digi and etc., but I think some of the really sort of transformational science stuff. I mean, when I talk to some of the people at CSIRO about ideas that could really step change soil management and therefore yield improvement, it's out of the box stuff. And I noticed there was a question online about, can we still invest in those high risk things? I think that's part of what, certainly from a grains perspective, it's part of what our obligation is to maybe invest in that initial phase, but of the right sort of stuff. Throwing continued incrementality focused investment behind things is maybe not the most efficient use of the growers levy, when we could be maybe making fewer bigger bets on some of the transformational stuff, while we're leveraging what we already know to keep the growers world improving.
Okay. Thanks, Tony. John, we lost you at a critical point.
Yeah, sorry about that. Look, just wanted to say, look, in response to both what Tony and Jason have said, it has big implications for individual researchers. So individual researchers putting up a research proposal for a little project just ain't going to cut it in the current environment. You've heard a number of RDCs saying bigger, better, more strategic, and that normally means you've got to be well organised and in good, in teams. And that's where I think, being part of QRM is a great advantage to you. But I think some of the teams are going to actually need to be even bigger than that. They're going to need to go across the whole of the country, and they're going to need to have international components. And that will make it much easier for RDCs to do business with you. If you've got those teams, got those connections, can actually quickly assemble the skills that you need to actually address one of those big issues. So for me, the thing that's really changed is the idea of an individual researcher, being a principal investigator, putting up a whole lot of proposals and getting a few up and then continuing to do what they've always done. It just ain't going to work in this current environment.
Okay, thanks, John. Really, I'll go, Alison, just a second. So it's not the 1990s, it's the 2020s, and the world has changed. And the message for people not to think we're in the same project by project world that we all knew and loved in the 1990s. Alison.
Yeah, concur with the others, and I won't repeat what they've already said. But it's really having that understanding of what the strategy is, having those discussions earlier, and then each research organisation knowing where their value proposition is. What exceptional capability do they have? What they might not also need to bring to the table across Australia or internationally. But then working with the RDCs where the shared goals and purpose is. And I guess also adding that as we move to co-investment models, looking to increase our co-investment pool. And I think we've had a mentality where the co-investor is also the delivery partner, but that shouldn't always have to be the case. How do the RDCs increase the co-investor pool, but they may not necessarily be the research provider. So if we've got a shared purpose, it meets both our strategic purposes with QRM, and there's a project that needs to be done, perhaps there's other co-investors out there that we can bring to the table as well. So I'll just add that.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. So thinking differently about the co-investor partners and delivery partners, research partners, and so on. Let me move on to the second question, which you know, if there'll be many early career, mid-career scientists, there'll be even students on the line in the participants here today. The future career pathways not all clearly mapped out. There's uncertainties there. It's not like it was in the 1990s. Clearly, a clear role for the R&D institutions to be fostering careers and thinking through these things. But what's the RDC view on creating a career pathway for research? Any thoughts, any reactions there? Jason, do you want to go first?
I think John, yeah, certainly, Brian. I think John touched on this a little bit in his answer previously, and the focus we have, and there's a couple of questions about high risk or early stage investments, and they're absolutely part of what we're talking about in being focused and having bigger bets. For example, there's absolutely no issue with investing in high risk R&D, but there's a big but to it, right? And that we've got to be more brutal in the way that we think about the performance of projects, regardless of how they've been formulated, so that we're making the best use of resources that do have a limit to them. And so the investment in careers is really important, but without sounding too harsh about it, that the individual careers aren't necessarily the R&D's, the RDC community's responsibility or the RDC's responsibility. However, our investment in strategic partnerships is, and when I say we're going to, from the red meat side, we're going away from all these individual projects, we're absolutely going to invest in programs of work. So developing more or larger, longer term, more strategic relationships with R&D providers will be an essential part of it. And in its simplest form, maybe it's the shift in thinking from my careers being funded by a project to my careers being funded from projects. Just may not always be the same one, and it may shift. So we're probably not going to have the luxury of saying, I'm going to have a career which will invest my R&D efforts in this issue or this question or this program, and I know I'm going to have a long-term commitment to it. Because if it's not delivering a result for the investor, the RDC or others, then chances are it's not going to continue.
Thank you, Jason. I'm getting close to our time. Any further perspectives on that issue? Tony and I think John maybe as well.
Yeah, and just thank you, Brian, and building on what Jason said, once again, I'm going to refer to my private sector background. The market will decide. The market will decide what skills we need. The market will decide what technological solutions it needs. I would encourage people to be thinking as broadly as they can about not just, shall we say, the traditional R&D roles, but the roles that are available for people with the sort of skill set and knowledge that researchers have in the private sector, along the value chain. If I've seen something that, the paths narrow so closely over the last 25 years I've been in the business, because so many, I suppose, of the R&D sort of space is driving against tangible benefit. And so much of what the market is looking for is the delivery of tangible benefit. So these courses are coming closer together. I just encourage people to be, open-minded in where the application of their skills, is going to be of most benefit to the value chain.
Thanks, Tony. Look, I'm going to wrap up now. I think we are almost at time. I gather from the organisers we're not going to have a long question time at this point, so I'll hand back in a second. My final question was going to be about the sort of pivot question. Everyone's pivoting at the moment because everything's unprecedented. I don't feel I have a need to ask that question because I'm hearing there's a lot of pivoting going on from in the RDC world. It's not 2010 when coffee started, it's 2020. It's a very different world, and so there's a really important message for coffee, is to realise that things have changed. With or without the pandemic, they've changed, and they do need to change the way they deepen their strategic partnering and deepen their focus on the sort of the value chains and deepen their global connectivity. So I'm going to leave it at that and just thank the participants very much for their wisdom and contributions today, and hand back to Peter Lewis. Peter, are you there?
Most definitely, I'm here, Brian, and thank you once again. A couple of pick-up points. Brian, you mentioned battered and bruised. Boy, oh boy, you're not on Robinson Crusoe there. Any reasonable analysis of lots of industry sectors, including the one that I've been involved in for nearly 40 years, ag media. We've had more hits than Elvis over the last 6 months, and I suspect there's more to come. It struck me that perhaps this sector, well, not perhaps, you definitely need friends in high places. Two things to emerge from that. It's obviously budget day, so you'll find out how many friends you've got in Canberra. And as I mentioned a little earlier, there is a state election campaign underway here in Queensland, so we could certainly look for a bit of love from George Street. The other thing is perhaps you need to be a little noisier and a little bit more upfront. To wit, I offer exhibits A and B, Peter Volandis from the National Rugby League and Gillan McLaughlin from the AFL. Boy, there's a couple of can-do guys. They didn't sit around waiting to see which way the economy and or society was heading. So maybe you need to recruit them into ag R&D. Just a thought. Unfortunately, John has gone. I was really keen to find out who the guy was in that photograph on his wall. It looked suspiciously like Robert Henry, but I could have been wrong. Look, great to hear from each and every one of our panel sessionists. We don't get an opportunity these days to catch up very much, particularly Jason and I. We only catch up at the cricket now. He's so busy. So look, what I want to do in the time that we do have left is I do want to remind you that this is an ongoing series. We've got a few more up our sleeve. The next QRM will be on Tuesday, October the 20th. Same time at 10 a.m. We'll be coming to you live streaming from the Coffee Centre here at St. Lucia. Directors will present on the future of coffee, what it'll look like, what it'll feel like and taste like. And the guest speaker on that occasion will be Bernadette Ditchfield, who's the Deputy Director General from DAF, and she'll be looking at future priorities for agricultural research in Queensland. So look, I hope you've enjoyed this morning's special look back, look forward on coffee, and we do encourage you to join us for the next meeting in this series on October the 20th. But for now, that's it.